Can anyone else? Ravi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, you can. Okay, good.
Hari, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Santosh.
I can't hear you, Hari.
Oh, you can't hear me. Um,
So you are audible, sir. Santosh, sir. You are also.
Santosh, can you hear? Oh, no.
Maybe uh,
But Ramesh, we are hearing you well.
maybe
Probably there is some
if
problem
you
with.
you should you
No,
try to
I'm in.
rejoin Hari? Will that work?
No, Hari is well audible here now.
Arun sir, are you speaking?
Yeah, I'm telling that Hari sir is very well audible to us.
Okay, Hari, can you speak once again?
Yes, can you hear me, Santosh?
Yeah, yeah, well.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
yes, I can hear now. I don't
you
know.
can you can hear me now, Santosh?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Arun sir. Thank you.
Thank you,
Oh,
sir.
Major sir, thank you. I just suspect that there is some problem on your point, so that I
Right.
intervene.
Could be at my side. Yes. Ravi, shall we start, Ravi, or shall we wait? Generally,
Seven,
Hari, I'm
seven, ten, sir.
sorry.
Seven, 10, sir. Just 7, 10.
Okay, okay. Generally, we take 10 minutes. Hari is
No problem.
sorry, it's a Indian time system.
No problem. No
But I
worries.
used to mention well,
Yeah.
really. So don't blame to Indians.
No blaming, sir. We are also Indian.
If I'll attain, then I'll come on right time. Always.
Yeah. Your new space look nice, Harin. Hari.
Thank you. This is my wife's parents' place. Actually, we're here right now. So They're traveling, so we're in their house, taking care of their house right now.
Okay.
Sir, you can start it.
Okay. Okay, let people will join in course of, and yeah. And generally there are a lot of viewers on YouTube, Hari. Those who can't make it, especially in this 1 hour span. That's how it series is on. Okay, friends, good evening, everyone. And once again, I wish you a very happy constitution who is holding, rather upholding Indian democracy in our time, which are challenging and at crossroad. And that crossroad has a lot of roads are coming in that cross, where we are navigating uh, the democratic values and what we are witnessing today. I think uh, in last few talks, I got some messages and some emails also from some friends, uh, and some messages on WhatsApp groups, as is a social media is also important. I notice people say, "Sir, we know all these things, and Dr. Ambedkar wrote Indian Constitution, uh, uh, and there are very interesting aspects of Constitution that our speakers are speaking. We should also focus on lot of areas, and India is a democracy which is successful, and so on and so forth." What my point is, I think by reading people's comment and conversation, apart from making our conceptual and theoretical and intellectual point, I realize how important it is to go back to fundamentals and understand the basic vision that Dr. Ambedkar or Indian Constitution try to put forth before country like India, which has a completely different historical, civilizational, cultural, economical, social processes. And I think, however, we keep on discussing these issues, they're unending, and every year, each day, they are fascinating. How it is relevant to discuss the aspects of Indian Constitution. So, in this series, I'm so happy today. Uh, we got Dr. Hari Ramesh from Wesleyan University. Hari is going to speak today on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and the democratic promises of state action, which is extremely important area what state has to promise, and relating that with the democratic ethos. On introductory note, Hari is a assistant professor of government at Wesleyan University, and he is a political theorist with research and teaching interest in democratic theory, histories, and theories of operation and intersection of South Asian, Afro-modern, and American political thought. It's an interesting tripartite interest that Hari shares. And his first book, titled Harnessing the State, Oppressed Groups and Pursuit of Radical Democracy, is forthcoming in 2026, which is very soon. And heartiest congratulations for that, Hari, for fourth coming book, and is going to be published from Harvard University Press. Uh, in the book, uh, Ramesh Satrap draws insights from uh, another interesting thinkers, John Dewey, Dr. Ambedkar, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And a key brief in the Brown versus Board of Education to argue that oppressed groups can and should wield the tools of the state to claim agency and dismantle the sources of their oppression. So, on this vision, state action guided by oppressed can foster radical democracy with equal citizens formulating and pursuing political aims together. The wonderful vision that I'm looking forward to read this book, Hari. And once again, behalf of CDS and all the organization, those who are organizing uh, this series, I welcome you and thank you very much for your time that you spared. And looking forward to listen your wonderful insights on such an important topic. Thank you very much. Hari, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And let me begin, of course, by thanking my friend Santosh Raut for inviting me to give this talk today. Thank you for such a kind introduction and such a humane and beautiful set of opening reflections. I'd also like to thank the Center for Dalit Studies and all affiliated institutions for putting together this series of talks. I've seen some of them on YouTube. I love that they are broadly available. These talks that are aiming to help us think critically about the Indian Constitution in its 75th anniversary year. I will say too that it is particularly good to be with you all, albeit on Zoom, at this moment. I live and work in the United States, where domination, cruelty, and violence are old features of political and social life. Yet these have unignorably taken on new, strange, and disturbing forms. In times like these, I find it a great comfort. I think it is a great comfort to be among those committed to creating a more humane and democratic world. There is a joy in community, especially a community committed to reflection, collective reflection. And it is not something to be taken for granted. Troubling times like these should also prompt political thinkers and actors to look to different and heretofore overlooked sources to guide theory and action. I will argue that contemporary putative liberal democracies like the United States have much to learn from the political thought of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, in particular from the vision of state action that he propounded between 1936, the year in which he published his most famous work, Annihilation of Caste, and 1947, when he joined the drafting committee of the Indian Constituent Assembly. As Santosh mentioned, the talk I'll give today is drawn from my forthcoming book, which is entitled Harnessing the State, Oppressed Groups and the Pursuit of Radical Democracy. The book looks to John Dewey, Ambedkar, the American school desegregation case, Brown versus Board of Education, and the radical black thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois, to develop the argument that oppressed groups can and should use the tools of the state to undermine the sources of their oppression and create democracies that are grounded in social equality between citizens. The book is transnational in its scholarly orientation, and it endorses the same spirit in projects of democratic reform. Democracies around the world stand in need of revivification. They need new directions, new lives. Some of the best guides for reform efforts may well come from beyond one's own shores, a possibility that we, and I speak here as an American citizen, can perceive if we exercise the requisite humility and clarity. In short, the United States, democracy in the United States has much to learn from the Indian experiment in democracy, and in particular from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's political thought. And with that, I will begin. Severe deprivation is relatively common in contemporary capitalist liberal democracies. Sometimes this is caused by the misguided choices of individuals or intentionally harmful government policies and social practices, but often there are more complex factors at play. In her 2011 book, Responsibility for Justice, the political theorist Iris Marion Young tells a hypothetical but realistic story about an American woman named Sandy. A single mother who did not attend college, Sandy must find a new apartment because her current building has been bought by a developer who plans to convert the units into luxury condominiums. Rental apartments are scarce and expensive near the place where Sandy works, a suburban mall. So Sandy, with her eviction date hanging over her, chooses to take a very small apartment that is a 45-minute drive from her job. Up until now, Sandy did not require a car as she lived on a bus route. Now, however, she needs one, and she spends much of her savings for a down payment on the car. However, she was not aware that she had to deposit 3 months' rent to obtain her new apartment, something she can no longer afford. Lacking the funds to rent the apartment, Sandy and her children now face the possibility of losing their housing altogether, the possibility of homelessness. The story of Sandy helps us see that the sources of hardship are often large, impersonal, and durable social processes rather than identifiably wrong actions. Sandy and her children face homelessness neither because of Sandy's avoidable imprudence nor the Dickensian cruelty of specific individuals. As Iris Young points out, not only is Sandy, quote, largely a victim of circumstances beyond her control, like her landlord's decision to sell in a labor market that channels non-college educated women into low-wage service work, but all the people she interacts with during her housing search, quote, act within the law and according to accepted norms and rules. The story also reminds us that social forces, though not reducible to bad intention, nonetheless create and position some groups such that they are more vulnerable than others. Sandy is a woman, a single mother, did not attend college, and is part of the working class, which is to say she belongs to several structural social groups that, for a variety of reasons, are disadvantaged relative to other groups. These are subordinated groups. When the social positions and relations of a subordinated group are so dire that they violate our intuitions and theories about justice, we judge that the group is oppressed. Suppose that we believe that in a just society, all individuals should have the necessary resources and opportunities to fully develop their capacities. That is, all persons should have the institutional supports they need to flourish in socially recognized ways. Insofar as members of certain groups are socially positioned so that they are denied the requisites for individual development when others have access to the same, they suffer an injustice and are oppressed. In contemporary political theory and philosophy, social oppression is generally defined in relation to justice, as I've just laid out. But consider too that a subordinated group's social position and relations can also run afoul of our intuitions and theories of democracy or collective self-government. Democratic theorists differ among themselves when it comes to the set of actions that all citizens without qualifications, are entitled to perform. But they agree that there are such actions. When political policies, social practices, or impersonal processes render members of a group unable to participate in these actions, when others are so able, we judge that something undemocratic is afoot. As a simple case, suppose that material and political conditions, lack of time away from work, viable transportation options, money to pay for transportation, lack of polling stations, inconvenient voting hours, make it extremely difficult for members of a particular group to cast their ballots to vote. We could justifiably say that a key democratic right, the right to vote, has been violated. But rights violation is only one of the ways social subordination can undermine democracy. Democratic theorists have proposed a variety of actions that citizens should be able to engage in, some of which are enshrined in rights and some of which are not. Gathering factual knowledge about public matters, asking public servants about their decisions and receiving transparent answers, speaking and being heard frankly in the public sphere, encountering other citizens on terms of equality in civil society, deliberating in good faith with fellow citizens about questions of public importance. Group-based subordination can prevent some citizens from living and acting in ways that are essential to democracy. When this happens, we say that these citizens are treated undemocratically or as second-class citizens. Following thinkers like Ambedkar and Du Bois, I would suggest that they are oppressed on a definition of oppression that is connected to democracy. Among modern liberal thinkers, a common response to oppression has been to invoke the role of the state. This perspective understands the state as the legitimate, neutral, and authoritative institution that guarantees the freedom and equality of all individuals who live permanently within a given territory. When citizens believe they have been treated unjustly, they can appeal to the state on this liberal view, which should have fair procedures for determining if injustice has been done and what the proper responses to injustice should be. Similarly, if citizens think they are subordinated in ways that prevent them from participating in necessary democratic activities, they should be able to turn to the state for fair adjudication and redress. Now, widely influential theories holding strong commitments to democracy have critiqued this understanding of the state, this liberal understanding of the state. Karl Marx's writings are foundational in this regard. Across many texts, Marx argued that under capitalism, the liberal democratic state was an outgrowth and servant of the economically dominant bourgeoisie. This position comported with his broader outlook, which understood the conditions of production as foundational to the overall social order. As superstructure, the liberal democratic state engaged in both coercive action, like criminalizing individual and collective behavior that contested the power of property owners, and stabilizing policies, like the introduction of moderate labor reforms that ensured that capitalist interests were served over the long term. Other theoretical traditions have learned from Marx's critique of the state, even as they have moved significantly beyond it. For example, feminist theorists have argued that the modern state embodies and coercively maintains patriarchal, heteronormative social orders. The state's perspective, norms, and modes of action track those of dominant sexual and gender groups, principally heterosexual men. Contemporary prison abolitionists have put forward similar arguments, asserting that the prison and policing are key linchpins of and deeply related to bourgeois democracy, in Angela Davis's phrase. There is historical evidence for this, particularly in the United States, where racialized mass incarceration has grown substantially alongside the purported progress in democratic inclusiveness. But abolitionists also articulate an important conceptual point. Freedom for the liberal democratic citizen is only knowable in opposition, they say, to the unfreedom of the prisoner. Freedom for the liberal democratic individual is only knowable in opposition to the unfreedom of the prisoner. For many abolitionist theorists, prisons and policing are the loci of oppression in a state apparatus controlled by society's most powerful interests. True democracy cannot emerge in such an order, but rather requires abolition. In the Indian context, some scholars of Dalit thought in politics have argued that the post-colonial state remains an instrument of wealthy upper caste elites that exerts violence upon Dalits and denies them basic human necessities. The Indian state perpetuates these abuses despite reservations policies that have aimed to incorporate more Dalits into the governmental apparatus. To annihilate caste and realize Indian democracy, these arguments say, it is argued that Dalit citizens must rethink their political orientation, which has been too deferential of state authority and designed to maintain the status quo. In addition to these perspectives, important and conceptually innovative contributions to democratic theory have questioned the relationship between the modern state and popular politics. The conviction that animates otherwise very different thinkers is that democracy's core and quintessence is when equal persons freely and physically assemble to collaborate in shaping their world. This broad vision arguably unites, among others, Hannah Arendt's conceptions of action and power, Sheldon Wolin's theory of fugitive democracy, and Massimiliano Tomba's notion of insurgency. On such visions, the modern state threatens to and often succeeds in neutralizing or actively destroying the creative force of the demos, of the people. It does this by, among other things, dividing and isolating citizens so that they cannot understand their commonalities or physically gather, bureaucratizing or moving into the realm of technical decision-making, issues that should be taken up by the people, and unleashing violence to instill fear and induce citizens to forget the power they possess as a collective. Authors in the Black radical tradition have independently and creatively theorized similar themes, writing against the backdrop of a modern age defined by racialized colonization, enslavement, and exploitation. These thinkers argue that Black sociality and politics has consistently been characterized by fugitivity, care, nonviolence, underground living, and the refusal of the terms of a statist politics that has invariably reinscribed racial hierarchies. This register of Black action not only works to cut into, interrupt, and expose modern capitalist, liberal, democratic tradition of representing the Western polity, but deserves appreciation and elaboration in the present as an emancipatory model of collective life away from the state. Now, I do not seek to wholly reject or overturn these critiques of the state, for they articulate powerful insights, both conceptually and practically. However, I do want to suggest that by looking to Ambedkar's political thought, we can loosen the hold they have on the contemporary political imagination of those who contest social hierarchy in the name of democracy. Now, that deep influence of these critiques of the state is discernible in what I suspect are relatively common views and heuristics for action. That the state is the primary or even the sole perpetrator of social oppression, that under conditions of social oppression, state action is necessarily above or external to oppressed groups and cannot plausibly be initiated and implemented by them, and that whatever its temptations, state action tends not to be able to address the sources of social oppression in ways that are conducive to a more democratic society. These, I think, are guiding ideas that stem from the depth and the pervasiveness of these critiques of the state. In Ambedkar's writings and speeches from 1936 to 1947, I argue, we can discern an alternative pattern of political reasoning, which emphasizes the plural sources of oppression, the possibility that oppressed groups can wield the tools of the state, and the radical democratic changes this strategy can bring about. So let me turn now then to Ambedkar. Now, members of this audience will be familiar with the detail and force with which Ambedkar outlined and condemned the conditions of Dalit oppression in 20th century India. What is less understood is the precise manner in which he situated the forms of oppression characteristic of caste society in relation to the political sphere. In a number of writings and speeches, Ambedkar used the concept of the communal majority to underscore how caste oppression in Indian social life, particularly the oppression of Dalits, led to political domination, and where the capture of representative institutions would then ensure the continuation of social oppression. With the idea of the communal majority, Ambedkar put forward an ontology of collective life in which the social and the political were deeply and inextricably intertwined. Political arrangements understood in this way as ineluctably fluid with the social, both shaped and were shaped by non-state processes in caste society. To say it plainly, Dalit oppression was both social and political. In a 1945 piece entitled Communal Deadlock and a Way to Solve It, Ambedkar introduced the idea of the communal majority by distinguishing it from a political majority. A political majority, he said, was defined by its impermanence, the fact that it was constantly being, quote, made, unmade, and remade, depending on the issues at hand. Its malleability and temporal specificity allowed the political majority to incorporate input from minority parties. The majority made concessions because of persuasive discussion and with longer-term strategy and coalition building in mind. A communal majority, by contrast, was, quote, a permanent majority fixed in its attitude. It was defined by caste-based birth status rather than by the play of civic discussion. As such, the communal majority acted politically as an undifferentiated, unchanging, and dominating bloc. Ambedkar then defined the communal majority by first, its reproduction through oppressive social relations, caste hierarchy, and disciplining practices so brutal, for example, the beatings, rapes, and murders of Dalits, that he once referred to them as lawfully lawless. And second, by its capacity, the communal majority's capacity to work through modern democratic institutions, above all, majority rule, in order to further entrench its dominant position. Ambedkar further discussed the concept of the communal majority in his extraordinary 1945 polemic, What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. In that book, he put forward the communal majority as a response to foreign commentators who not only offered unthinking sympathy for the Indian National Congress-led struggle for independence, but expressed puzzlement at the reluctance of significant portions of the Dalit population to participate in the Congress program. Why, for Ambedkar, was Dalit wariness of the Indian National Congress justified? Because in his words, quote, free India should be made safe for democracy. Starting with this aim, they, Dalits, say that on account of the peculiar social formation in India, There are minority communities pitted against a Hindu communal majority, and that if no provisions are made in the Constitution to cut the fangs of the Hindu communal majority, India will not be safe for democracy, end quote. Foreign commentators' impoverished understanding of the political conditions in India was the result of a democratic theory that lacked the tools to take account of the case. Ambedkar's analysis of, quote, the wrong notions of self-government and democracy which are prevalent in the West revealed that the missing conceptual piece was the communal majority. As far as Ambedkar was concerned, Western writers, quote, omit to take into account the incontrovertible fact that in every country there is a governing class grown up by force of historical circumstances, which is destined to rule, which does rule, and to whom adult suffrage and constitutional morality are no bar against reaching places of power and authority, end quote. It's an extraordinarily powerful passage by Dr. Ambedkar there. Western writers, quote, omit to take into account the incontrovertible fact that in every country there is a governing class grown up by force of historical circumstances, which is destined to rule, which does rule, and to whom adult suffrage and constitutional morality are no bar against reaching places of power and authority. Here, Ambedkar articulates how liberal democratic arrangements, bluntly applied to an Indian society built around caste, had the effect of further entrenching that form of oppression. His invocation of historical circumstances suggests the imbalance of forces at play. To be effective, the introduction of modern democracy in India had to contend with, indeed, combat, hierarchies and practices whose momentum had accrued over centuries. Now, Ambedkar coupled his condemnations of Dalit oppression, caste society, and the communal majority with an alternative normative vision. This radically different future for India was characterized by renewed social relations between castes, as well as what we might call a healthy, non-pathological continuity between society and state. Um, I'll be happy to talk later about, in the question and answer, about how Ambedkar used the notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity to think about renewed social relations between castes. But for now, I will just focus on how he formulated a new vision of the relationship between society and state, one that stood in stark contrast to the communal majority. To lay out this vision, Ambedkar invoked an expansive conception of democracy, one that encompassed both the political and the social spheres. In addition, he specified the kind of inter-citizen activity, something he called endosmosis, that ought to accompany renewed social relations between castes and facilitate a healthy, non-communal continuity between society and state. Both these moves were self-consciously made with the use of John Dewey's democratic theory. And indeed, the word endosmosis comes directly from Dewey. As such, I want to suggest that we gain important insight into Ambedkar's democratic project by framing these elements as creative adaptations and recontextualizations of Dewey's democratic vision. As many of you will know, Ambedkar studied at Columbia University in New York from 1913 to 1916, where he took classes with several notable faculty: Edwin Seligman, James Harvey Johnson, James Shotwell, Charles Beard, and John Dewey. Dewey's influence on Ambedkar was lasting. Writing from New York to his wife Savita shortly after Dewey's passing, Ambedkar lamented the American philosopher's passing. Quote from the letter, "I am so sorry. I owe all my intellectual life to him. He was a wonderful man." End quote. Ambedkar was in New York to receive an honorary doctorate from Columbia alongside the great American poet Wallace Stevens. It's a detail that I always like. In a 1943 piece entitled Ranade, Gandhi, and Jinnah, Ambedkar criticized theories put forward by early Indian anti-colonial nationalists, claiming that certain changes at the political institutional level were sufficient for the cultivation of democracy in India. The purveyors of such theories made a foundational error, for they neglected to understand that, quote, democratic form of government presupposes a democratic form of society. The formal framework of democracy is of no value and indeed would be a misfit if there was no social democracy. The politicals, these early nationalists, never realized that democracy was not a form of government. It was essentially a form of society. The formulation here, Ambedkar's formulation here, echoes one of the most important passages in John Dewey's 1888 essay, The Ethics of Democracy, a piece that we know Ambedkar read and remembered well. There, Dewey asserts that, quote, democracy in a word is a social, that is to say, an ethical conception, and upon its ethical significance is based its significance as governmental. Democracy is a form of government only because it is a form of moral and spiritual association, end quote. For Dewey, it was clear that social relations profoundly informed democratic acts and institutions, for example, voting, such that these would be, quote, manifestations of some tendency of the social organism through a member of that organism. We can see why, given his context, this idea would have been appealing to Ambedkar. Theorizing democracy in sufficiently capacious terms as to include both the social and the political, that is, conceiving of democracy as a way of life, meant emphasizing the necessity of creating social relations that made it possible for political majorities and not communal majorities to drive the decisions that would affect the community. Ambedkar also invoked Dewey when he named the kind of inter-citizen activity that would take place in a flourishing democracy, using a word that Dewey deployed in his seminal 1916 book, Democracy and Education. The word was endosmosis. In a chapter from an unpublished work in progress on India and communism, Ambedkar argued that endosmosis occurs when, quote, there is free play back and forth between social groups, quote, when they have an equable opportunity to receive and take from others. He then suggests how endosmosis sustains a thriving and progressive society, arguing that, quote, such social contacts must and do dissolve custom, make for an alert and expanding mental life, and not only occasion but demand reconstruction of mental attitudes, end quote. In short, endosmosis, as Ambedkar took up the idea and adapted it, changed it from Dewey, names the set of dynamic experimental processes whereby citizens across the democratic polity collectively shape and reshape their understanding of their interests, both in response to the consequences of political decision making and in order to affect the operation of formal institutions. Aided then by Deweyan ideas, Ambedkar counterposed the circumstances of Dalit oppression, caste society, and the communal majority to a radical vision of democracy that encompassed social and political life, in which members of previously hierarchical groups would meet each other as equals, encounter each other's interests and experiences, and use these to inform their conceptions of the common good. That is the normative alternative. Now, during the same period that he theorized a Dewey-inflected vision of democracy in India, Ambedkar sought to break the communal majority's grip, and in so doing, decisively moved toward realizing this vision of radical democracy. In order to achieve these ends, Ambedkar linked certain kinds of guaranteed Dalit representation with state power. More specifically, he perceived at least three democratic possibilities in the strategy of Dalits harnessing the tools of the state via the mechanisms of representation. The first was a perceptual shift, whereby the caste Hindu majority would come to acknowledge Dalits' full capacities for citizenship. The second was the tactical appeal of turning to the state, given the nature of caste society. And the third was the sheer transformative capacity of the state as an instrument to refashion caste society. And I'll just focus on the second and third of these for now. That is to say, the tactical appeal of turning to the state given the nature of caste society, and the transformative capacity of the state as an instrument to refashion caste society. Ambedkar thought that anti-caste reformers had to account for the fact that caste oppression was perpetuated in part by deeply ingrained and habitual forms of religious thought and practice. This view comes through in section 21 of his most famous work, Annihilation of Caste, where Ambedkar suggests that, quote, to ask people to give up caste is to ask them to go contrary to their fundamental religious notions. The Hindus hold to the sacredness of the social order. The possibility of reasoned analysis from within caste society itself was, he thought, a dim one. From a tactical perspective, from the point of view of effective means, any faith that imminent critique could lead to genuine social reform was deeply misplaced. Moreover, even granting the distortion in representative institutions that followed from the communal majority, the state was not compromised to the same extraordinary extent as was caste society. There remained, Ambedkar thought, the very real possibility that the state could operate as the outgrowth of popular sovereignty, rather than succumbing to the jealous influences of caste sovereignty. During the 1930s and 40s, Ambedkar consistently tied this thought to the institutional mechanism of a separate Dalit electorate, more specifically, an arrangement for legislative representation in which Dalits could both vote for their representatives in a dedicated electorate and cast a vote as part of the general electorate. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar inquired into the significance of guaranteed representation for Dalits via the mechanism of separate electorates. His answer pointed to the imperative of turning to the political sphere when space to maneuver in the social realm had been constricted or even rendered impossible. The significance of a separate electorate was, quote, this, that a political constitution must take note of social organization. It shows that the politicians who denied that the social problem in India had any bearing on the political problem were forced to reckon with the social problem in devising the constitution, end quote. In the face of deep, intractable social oppression that hamstrung the very possibility of democracy, the turn to political institutions was not Ambedkar's naive glorification of the state, but rather a sober conclusion about what the most promising source of reform was. Ambedkar furthered this tactical commitment by offering up concrete institutional proposals that would take advantage of the state's transformative capacity vis-a-vis Dalit oppression and caste society. This was nowhere more evident than a 1947 pamphlet cum draft constitution entitled States and Minorities that Ambedkar authored on behalf of his political party, the All India Scheduled Castes Federation. States and minorities include several sweeping measures designed to reorder caste society using the power of the state. These included the following three proposals. First, wide definition and severe punishment for the perpetration of social boycott, the practice of ostracizing lower caste individuals and groups. In states and minorities, Boycotting would take place in interactions of all sorts, from commercial to religious to political. Moreover, one was guilty of violating the law against boycott not merely by personally executing it, but by instigating or promoting a boycott. So, severe monitoring of and punishment for practices of social boycott is one way in which Ambedkar thought in states and minorities, state power could transform caste society. Second, complete state sponsorship of Dalit education, including foreign graduate education abroad of the kind Ambedkar enjoyed. Third, the creation of a resettlement commission, which would claim uncultivated lands and assist Dalits in resettling these lands, with an eye toward reorganizing oppressive spatial geography of Indian villages and breaking the relations of economic dependence between caste Hindus and lower castes, who often worked as landless laborers. For the Ambedkar of the 1930s and 40s, a strong and activist state could deploy a variety of tools to remake caste society in such a way as to achieve the ambitious democratic ends for which he thought India should strive. As the literary scholar Arun Mukherjee rightly observes, quote, Ambedkar's demand of the British government that the Indian constitution mandate reservations in administration, in the legislature, and in the executive can be read as his attempts to promote social endosmosis through the use of government power, end quote. But I think we can be even more specific. Properly conceived, institutions that facilitated Dalit representation would enable them to harness state action and to undermine the conditions of caste-based oppression and generate lasting and radically democratic change. I have argued then that Ambedkar put forward a distinct form of state action in which Dalits could harness the tools of government to undermine the sources of their oppression, and in so doing, create the conditions for a radical form of democracy grounded in both political and social equality. Ambedkar's basic insight that oppressed groups harnessing the state is a democratically valuable form of political action need not be restricted to his 20th century Indian context. Rather, it can provide important theoretical and practical insight today. Now, to be sure, several questions would need to be answered to make good on this claim, to justify that claim. Questions like the following: how should we understand the production and reproduction of unequal groups in contemporary liberal democracies? What standards and processes should we use to judge which groups are oppressed and which are not? What are the reasons why state action aimed at undoing the sources of oppression should be directed by the input of relevant oppressed groups themselves? What are the limitations in principle and in practice to the kinds of changes that state action can bring about? In my book, I offer answers to these questions, and I'm happy to talk about them in the question and answer. In my remaining time, however, let me highlight some notable ways that oppressed groups already harness the state for radical democracy, provide some general principles that can guide reform efforts to better enable oppressed groups in contemporary liberal democracies to engage in this form of political action, and offer some concrete avenues for such reform. Now, consider first the uh, domain of state action that we call agenda setting. I define agenda setting by the oppressed as the means through which members of oppressed groups can shape that subset of items to which public institutional action is restricted, such that this subset includes the sources of their oppression and potential remedies. Now, we can look to both the past and the present for relevant, if imperfect, instances of agenda setting by the oppressed. For example, in his book, Democracy by Petition, the political scientist Daniel Carpenter discusses the Savannah, Georgia Freedmen's Petition of summer 1865, which called for the impeachment of the American president, Andrew Johnson, on the grounds that his leniency toward former Confederate rebels had unleashed a wave of violence against Black people in the South. Carpenter observes that the petitioners, many of whom were Black veterans of the Civil War, departed from previous practice by appealing directly to the U.S. Congress, the body that could alone impeach the president. The 1865 petition anticipated a broader agenda-setting phenomenon. The 39th Congress of the United States, which served from 1865 to 1867, received over 36 petitions for Johnson's impeachment, including several from Black communities. And as Carpenter notes, it was, quote, a sign of the interplay between congressional strategy and mass petitioning that virtually every leader of the impeachment effort had received and introduced petitions calling for Johnson's trial and removal, end quote. The petition functioned as a vehicle through which an oppressed group's Black freedmen, not even yet protected by the 14th or 15th Amendments, could make visible to the state the conditions and causes of their oppression, as well as a solution, the impeachment of the president, that would provide remedy. Moreover, Black freedmen were not unique in this regard, for the petition, Carpenter makes clear in his book, long served as vehicles through which oppressed groups could shape agendas. That being said, Carpenter observes that while this institutional vehicle, the petition, was central to democratization in the 19th century, it is by no means sufficient today. Contemporary liberal democracies need more and stronger mechanisms through which oppressed groups can set agendas. Reform, then, should be guided by the goals of strengthening existing institutions of agenda setting by the oppressed and proliferating new mechanisms of agenda setting by the oppressed. As a suggestive example, consider local and national public hearings on poverty, about which the legal scholar Tara Melish has insightfully written. These hearings are, to quote Melish, quote, fora in which the poor come together and give direct testimony about their lived experiences, and quote, propose targeted solutions, large and small, to the crisis of service delivery, economic planning, and arbitrary or discriminatory public and private action in the field of social and economic rights, end quote. Melish approvingly cites the 1998 South African National Speak Out on Poverty hearings, which was jointly organized by civil society groups and state institutions, and enabled poor citizens to speak on the record about the obstacles they faced and the action they thought needed to be taken by state officials. Despite their promise from an agenda-setting perspective, well-funded, organized, and publicized hearings on poverty are not nearly as common as they could be. In the United States, the responsibility for carrying out such hearings often falls solely to civil society groups, like the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. States could partner with these groups in more ambitious ways, and in so doing, formalize a sorely needed mechanism for the poor to shape governmental priorities. Cases like these suggest that there is space to implement new agenda-setting mechanisms for oppressed groups. Just as we can imagine state-supported public hearings on poverty, so too could we imagine such hearings on untouchability, racism, and sexual violence. Let me now turn to a second domain of state action and a second way we can imagine that oppressed groups can harness the state for radical democracy: legislation. Ambedkar, of course, emphasized the importance of Dalit participation in legislative politics, by which I mean the crafting and passing of laws in both national and lower level bodies. This commitment led to two, as I mentioned before, interrelated and noteworthy institutional recommendations, neither of which came to pass: separate electorates and the double vote. The former would have ensured that there were legislative seats for which only Dalits could stand for election and vote. The latter, that Dalits could vote in both their separate electorates and as part of the general electorate. To remind ourselves, Ambedkar thought innovations like these would pave the way for Dalit representatives who would forcefully advocate for their constituents. He also thought these institutions would ensure the legislative importance of ordinary Dalit voters, for they would be positioned as an unignorable constituency. A rich literature in contemporary political theory has theorized representation with an eye toward justifying the representation of oppressed groups in legislatures. I thus think it is more useful, I think because this ground has been covered, I think it's more useful to consider how oppressed citizens can shape legislation more directly in ways that supplement and go beyond voting for formal representatives and empowering those representatives to take specific actions. Indeed, there is significant scope in contemporary liberal democratic polities to push beyond existing representative-focused ways of incorporating oppressed groups into legislative processes and create reforms that will enable such groups to more robustly harness this arm of the state in the interest of generating the social conditions for democracy. And here the guiding principle I offer is the following. Reforms should aim to create meaningful opportunities for members of oppressed groups to shape legislation that demonstrably pertains to the sources of their oppression. As an example of such reform, consider mandatory legislative consultation with oppressed groups who stand to be particularly affected by a proposed piece of legislation. This would require that legislatures solicit non-binding input from activists, civil society organizations, and ordinary citizens hailing from oppressed communities when drafting and/or revising pieces of legislation that are likely to significantly affect these communities. In cases where the legislature rejects the input given by oppressed citizens, formal and public feedback must be provided for why the legislature took the decision it did. Legal scholars have written on existing examples of mandatory legislative consultation and made compelling cases for its institutionalization in liberal democratic countries that do not yet possess this requirement. For example, Karen Chapinski and Rashida Manju analyzed the role of the South African Human Rights Commission in facilitating public input into the Older Persons Bill, which became the Older Persons Act of 2006. This process involved extensive consultation facilitated by the South African Human Rights Commission, with actors advocating for older persons as well as older persons themselves. This included a South African Human Rights Commission hosted informational workshops, small group brainstorming sessions on specific aspects of the bill, and the creation of a national forum in which the interests of older persons could be publicly discussed. The consultative process accompanying the Older Persons Bill is a South African success, but the lesson may extend elsewhere. For example, Deepika Jain argues that India would benefit greatly from mandatory legislative consultation and points to the sustained critique and protest following the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill 2016 and the weak revisions made to the 2018 bill as evidence that a legislative process lacking consultation failed transgender people in India. Finally, Consider the domain of administration, which the political theorist Bernardo Zacca calls, quote, the vast regulatory and public service bureaucracies and their countless employees and extensions that conduct the daily business of government, and, quote, form the stable core of the executive branch. While the administrative state typically functions at some remove from ordinary oppressed citizens, there have been historical moments when ambitious attempts were made to overcome this distance and hostility between the administrative state and oppressed groups. In the American context, a particularly promising example was the participatory language built into the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act. In the words of Tara Melish, quote, proceeding on an understanding that neither voting rights, federal income supports, nor top-down professional provision of social services to the poor by themselves were sufficient to guarantee equal opportunity and responsive policy solutions for all social sectors, especially historically marginalized ones. Title II of the Act mandated the maximum feasible participation of affected communities in the development, implementation, and administration of programs aimed at eliminating the causes of poverty. Now, although it has a specific historical origin, the idea of maximum feasible participation is broad and normatively appealing enough to help us see how many different oppressed groups, not just the poor, in the United States and in other liberal democratic polities, can harness the administrative arm of the state to create the conditions for radical democracy. In short, I believe reform efforts should be guided by the goal of maximizing the feasible participation of oppressed groups in administrative action that demonstrably pertains to the sources of their oppression. As an example of this, consider the idea of co-enforcement, put forward by the political scientist Janice Fine and several collaborators. Co-enforcement is a strategy whereby government partners with organizations like labor unions and worker centers, which have deep relationships with vulnerable workers, to ensure that employers comply with labor laws. Fine notes that the contemporary labor enforcement regime in the United States faces several impediments. These include decreased funding for investigative staff who inspect employers, the proliferation of small firms, and subcontracting practices in low-wage sectors, and the high percentage of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, working in environments in which their rights are likely to be violated. Co-enforcement meets these challenges by formalizing the partnership between government and worker organizations, and thereby leveraging the complementarities in knowledge and skill between workers, worker organizations, and state regulators, and even, quote, high road firms that have the visibility and power to set labor standards in their industry. One of Fine's examples of co-enforcement is the partnership between the Austin, Texas-based Worker Defense Project and the Austin Police Department. Founded in 2002, the Workers Defense Project is a membership-based organization whose mission is to empower low-income workers to achieve fair employment through education, direct services, organizing, and strategic partnerships. One of WDP's first initiatives was to advocate for workers in the construction industry, many of them Latino immigrants, who were victims of wage theft. They did this by forging a co-enforcement relationship with the police department. Together, the WDP, the Workers' Defense Project, the police department, the Mexican consulate, and others jointly formulated the criteria for non-payment, wage theft, to constitute the intent not to pay and therefore merit investigation. After this, a decades-long partnership unfolded in which the Workers' Defense Project formally aided the Austin Police Department in investigating wage theft, negotiating with employers, deciding whether an arrest warrant was justified, and collecting unpaid wages for vulnerable workers. This example, one of many that Fine provides in her research, helps us see the strategic promise of linking vulnerable workers, their organizations, and the state apparatus in order to rectify and check instances of labor law violation. Taken together, then, the considerations I have offered on harnessing the state today suggest that one of Ambedkar's key insights, that oppressed groups can and should harness the state to create the conditions for radical democracy, can be taken up in many different contemporary liberal democracies. Dr. Ambedkar left us with many legacies indeed, but this one may prove particularly salutary in animating progressive politics and institutions in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hari, uh, for very intense and dense uh, sort of ideas that needs to really, uh, thought through carefully in present discourses in democracy and how state harness not only the legislature and the states and the bureaucracies, but also very fundamental concerns for the uh, democratic state to become a or translate into a democratic action. Uh, Thank you very much for that, and very rightly sort of said that how liberal democracies in Marxian term can serve the bourgeoisies. That's the language Marx used, but as Dr. Ambedkar very rightly
हेलो
said,
सर, नमस्कार जी।
uh, where Dr. Ambedkar was arguing that government in India is the government of governing class. It's not a government of a people. It's a government of governing class, and that's what happened probably in the transfer of power than independence. It's so important. You sort of brought out with a very intense and um, how to say, deep arguments that you are making. Uh, Also, the social democracies in terms of liberty, equality, fraternity, and the alternate that Dr. Ambedkar suggests to renew the social relationship for a flowering, successful political democracy, or the state as a democratic state to be flower in terms of democratic politics, if I put it that way, will be the much better way. Having said that, before I invite questions from our participant, I will just ask one question so that that can begin the Q&A. My point is, liberal democracies are failed, and I am think Marx, Ambedkar, and all the liberal thinkers would probably agree with this, because democracy can be gullible. It in terms of turning state as a democratic action, because it is still dominated by, let's say, economically dominant class in the West and upper caste in India, particular. Uh, and Dr. Ambedkar argues that unless it is anchored into values, therefore he is equating democracy with associated living or fraternity with Maitri or liberty, equality borrowed from the Buddhist time and again try to orient the entire democratic project must not turn into a mere liberal in form but oppressive in practice. So how do you see, Hari, those the not way forward is a very vague expression, but how Dr. Ambedkar's model will operate in a continuously complex and operation that, as you rightly pointed out, religiously sacred system that people have embraced, may that be in Hindu or even in Islam. It continues to operate in hierarchical base, which Dr. Ambedkar wanted to change. So, would you like to comment on that, and how oppressed people can sort of not only shape legislature, as you very rightly said, but also shape the social policies, economic policies?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Santosh, for those questions. I think the basic insight that I see in this period of Ambedkar's writings is, as I mentioned, the diagnosis and condemnation of oppression as anti-democratic, the um, positing of a normative alternative grounded in these values, Santosh, that you so rightly highlighted, and the use of state action directed by oppressed groups themselves, by Dalits themselves, as one strategy to transition from oppressive conditions to democratic conditions. And the insight there is that the state, um, and this may be, I think, one way in which Ambedkar differs from Marx. The state is a complex apparatus that is not at every single moment purely dominated by anti-Dalit interests. There are parts of the state that can be used strategically in order to intervene in social and economic life and equalize those parts of life in order to create the conditions for this radical conception of democracy. So the state, parts, components of the state, some components of the state can be used strategically, even as other components of the state are obviously oppressive and obviously dominated by the interests of the most powerful groups in society. Now, I use the word strategically very intentionally here. I think this idea of harnessing the state for radical democracy is best understood as a strategy. And that means a few different things. But one important thing that it means is that it is not the only way of creating a democratic order based in values, as you rightly put it, Santosh. It's not the only way of doing that. Obviously, the work of collective mobilization, social movements, the work even of um, civil society organizations, schools, spiritual organizations that promote these new values and spread them outwards in ways that are not immediately connected to the state, those are all valuable, and I do not deny that. What I do think, however, is that Ambedkar offered a distinct strategy, a distinct way of seeing some of the way that the state apparatus can be used that is underappreciated today, and underappreciated, including in parts of the West and including in the United States, where Dr. Ambedkar's thought needs to be read more widely for these democratic insights. So that's maybe my thoughts.
And just a quick comment I would like to hear from you, Hari. When you said that American democracy has to learn from Dr. Ambedkar, there are already currents in Western democracies or American democracies about black struggle and race struggle. There are currents available, and you see there are movements also like Martin Luther King and so on and so forth. There are leaders who advocated that. My question is, what do you think are the model from Dr. Ambedkar that West or America can learn?
Well, I do think that it's some of what I've highlighted in the talk, which is the three elements in particular. One is a plural understanding of the sources of oppression. I think Ambedkar was remarkably insightful in pinpointing the simultaneously religious, economic, political, cultural uh, dimensions of Dalit oppression. And I think in the United States in particular, where oppression is often simply the prime source of oppression is often simply thought of as the government. I think we stand to learn much from the subtlety of Ambedkar's social theory. Second is what I just mentioned, which is the instrumental and strategic uses of state action by oppressed groups. I think that is one of Ambedkar's key insights. And the third is exactly what I just said, and what you've just, I now keep using your phrase, Santosh, a democracy grounded in values, a democracy that is simultaneously social and political, a democracy in which people encounter one another, diverse individuals and groups encounter one another's interests, experiences, and use these to shape the common good. Democracy is not reducible simply to a set of political arrangements like voting, but rather is something deeper woven into our social fabric. That, I think, is a deep point in Ambedkar that we stand to learn from. Now, what is interesting is that there were American thinkers, and in my book, I talk about W.E.B. Du Bois in particular, who took on board some of these ideas. And indeed, one of the reasons, I'll just say this quickly by way of wrapping up my answer, one of the reasons why Du Bois in his writings was so fixated on the moment, the historical moment of Reconstruction, which followed the American Civil War, was that this was a moment, an unprecedented moment, and a moment that has not really been replicated since, in which Black Americans, Black men, I should say, were able to wield the tools of the government, primarily state governments in the South, to address some of the conditions of their oppression following the abolition of slavery. And so, like Ambedkar, I think Du Bois is attuned to some of the strategic ways in which the oppressed group with which he was most familiar, in Du Bois's case, Black Americans, could wield the tools of the state to intervene in social and economic life and thereby create a democracy grounded in values, grounded in social equality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hari. And I think this is one of the missed opportunities in the history of modern democracies in the world, that Du Bois and Dr. Ambedkar, the very celebrated sort of figures, unlike Dewey, could not really cultivate the bond in terms of exchanging ideas, though scholars can now develop upon those germs they have left for us. Thank you for that response. Uh, I would invite generously from the audience. Of course, we are running a bit of out of time, but questions from the participants, if you want to ask anything to Hari. I see Shailesh, Vishal. Arun sir left. He has something we want to ask, but he's put in the chat box that he has to leave for some emergency. Yes, Vishal, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Hi. I thank you for a very insightful deck. Yeah, I'm from Austin. You mentioned Austin model. I am a graduate student at UT Austin. Uh, I was wondering about, after your talk, I felt like you seem to be reinstating the faith in liberal democratic model that in present state it seemed to be failing to the question of press because the models that you highlighted and also other political scientists have actually suggested recommended for oppress group. I think in my observation, it is Dalit community or let's say caste oppressed community who have been constantly in coordination with the state, like asking for reservation, asking for social benefits, getting on the roads. But what we see today that in the 75 years of experience, the condition still remains the same. It has not yielded any, fruitful or productive outcomes. In fact, it has widened the gaps, like some intensified the gaps instead of encouraging or enabling the social endosmosis that we are talking about here. So one part of the responsibility lies on the state, which state has remarkably failed in cultivating in the last 70 years of Indian experience. Instead of cultivating constitutional values, in fact, it took a lot of time for state to introduce Constitution Day, and it was Dalit community who was celebrating Constitution autonomously, regardless of state. So, uh, my question is like, I have sort of lost hope in democratic, liberal democratic model. So, and even in the West, you can see like using the same liberal democratic framework, you see the rise of authoritarian populist leaders through voting machinery. So, how do you see this current state of scenario of liberal democratic framework, which do not seem to be offering a promising framework or promises, hope for let's say reimagining what we have today?
Thank you, Vishal, for those perceptive and challenging questions. Very good. I'll say a couple things about that. Um, the first is the idea that I sort of try and take out of Dr. Ambedkar's thought and work into a contemporary political theory, which is to say the idea of oppressed groups harnessing the state for radical democracy. Um, that is that is an idea that um, is different than the way, or I should say, it names an orientation that oppressed groups have towards the state that is different than what we normally talk about, or at least that's what I try to do. So normally what we talk about is making claims on the state, or asking the state, or approaching the state. And these are, I would say, these name an orientation of supplication. Please, please, state, do this. Please, state, do that. And what I think is Dr. Ambedkar was not advocating for that orientation of supplication, asking the state to intervene. The idea of harnessing the state is meant to convey a much more active orientation that oppressed groups like Dalits can have vis-a-vis state action, which is to say, it is working through the state, wielding the tools of the state, using the tools of the state, rather than supplicating, requesting the state, as if the state were some sort of external entity. Instead, marshaling the state. So that's maybe one thing to say. Um, when we talk about the failures of the state, I actually agree with you on many of these points. It is true. But I think the idea and the strategy and institutions that can facilitate oppressed groups harnessing the state have not been sufficiently tried out. That's one thing. The second is, I think I should distinguish between, let's just say, conventional liberal democracy and what I'm calling, following Dewey and Ambedkar, radical democracy. So conventional liberal democracies, um, and this is partly what the comments on Marx were meant to bring out, conventional liberal democracies are fully compatible with vast inequalities and forms of oppression in social and economic life. So to put it bluntly, if everyone has the right to vote, well, it doesn't matter how much wealth some accumulate, or how impoverished some people are, or how much certain people suffer um, from cultural discrimination of various kinds. Well, everyone has the right to vote. Everyone has equality in the formal political sphere. And I think that notion of, let's say again, conventional liberal democracy is, I don't, I agree with you. I think it's failed. What I'm instead trying to draw out is the notion of, what Dewey called democratic association, or democracy as a form of associated life, what Ambedkar took up later, which let's just say grounds democracy in a form of social egalitarianism, where diverse individuals are encountering one another's experiences, respecting each other's interests, and using these to create their conceptions of the common good. Now, what is required for that is much more equalization of other resources than political resources in in the polity. However, I do think that the state can be strategically used to equalize some of those resources. And again, it's not the only strategy that can be used, but the state can be harnessed to equalize some of those social and economic resources. So that's maybe some way towards an answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal, for that great question.
Maybe probably a last question, because uh, with respect of time, uh, any other comment or question from participant, please?
I'll just say thank you, Vishal, for mentioning creative democracy. Exactly. That's I love that piece by Dewey. Um, and Dewey there, I'll just signal this. I think that in my book, I worked this out a little bit more. Dewey, particularly later in his career, um, becomes highly skeptical of the use of state action to create the conditions for his radical conception of democracy. And he turns to a variety of anti-statist forms of organizing, of what he calls localism, and what he calls organized intelligence. And this is one respect, I think, in which Ambedkar and Dewey are different. I think Ambedkar thought, in the face of very deep forms of social hierarchy, certain forms of state action needed to be strategically utilized. And this is one interesting, I think, and important way in which Ambedkar moved away from and developed Dewey's ideas.
Dr. Santosh?
Yes, Shailesh, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a very brilliant uh, talk. Uh, I don't know whether am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Uh, Very quickly, uh, I think taking the case of India, and it's also some kind of reflection of 75 years that we are completed already. uh, we have so many legislations as far as protection and safeguarding the interest and fundamental rights of the marginalized, or what we can say formerly untouchables. but we find that actually there is no mechanism as such that we can ensure that these legislations are also implemented in a true spirit. And we often find that whenever Dalit come onto the street and they protest against certain kind of oppressive kind of practices for social justice, often the government comes out with some kind of a legislation. But the legislations, in spite of having given the legal justice by within the constitutional kind of a framework, this legal justice often doesn't get converted into social justice. Now, as you rightly pointed out, Baba Sahib Ambedkar actually prepared this draft on behalf of Scheduled Caste Federation, All India Scheduled Caste Federation, the states and minorities. And I think Baba Sahib also called this as a constitution draft of the United States of India. So he had a lot of these ideas from US constitution, and also what he studied from people like Dewey and other great thinkers. Ambedkar had this, but then end of the day, he was also skeptical that how much of this will be, given the kind of a mentality we have in India, that how many of this will be certainly be implemented in true spirit. So he was always skeptical about it. So I just wanted your reflection that we have so many legislation that we don't need any kind of extra legislation now for Dalit as such. But then we need more honest kind of efforts on the part of the ruling elites in this country to implement them in spirit. And then what Ambedkar said in Constituent Assembly, that the although it's a top democracy remains only a top dressing, on a structure which is inherently undemocratic. How do how does one think of addressing this after 75 years of India's democratic process? That's the reflection I wanted. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shailesh Kumar. Those are really beautifully put reflections. Um, I'll just say a few things quickly. One is there is, I think, a distinction between, let's say, formal pieces of legislation that protect vulnerable communities against, um, let's just say, distinct acts like atrocities, violent atrocities, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the reorganization of social processes that produce durable inequalities and hierarchies in society. So even if we have, let's say, sufficient legislation or any number of pieces of legislation that protect against the first kind of thing, distinct acts like atrocities, I do not think that governments have generally gone far enough in liberal democracies in reorganizing the social processes that produce and reproduce durable forms of inequality. We would need new forms of education. We would need new forms of, let's say, organizing the conditions of production and the distribution of goods, etc. Those, I think, bring us further in the direction of democracy, as Dewey and Ambedkar conceived of democracy, than just the legislation with respect to specific acts. But with that said, um, I think there's a very, very deep point, Shailesh Kumar, that you bring up about skepticism. Um, And it really is, it was the dimension of skepticism, I will say, in indeed seeing the skepticism, and in some ways in his later writings on Ambedkar's profound disappointment in the conditions of Indian democracy that led me to conceive of harnessing the state as just a strategy. So, not a silver bullet or not the only solution to our democratic ills today, but one, let's just say, modest proposal from a young political theorist about a form of political action that can make our polities more democratic. That means that it is compatible, it's meant to be compatible with other forms of political action, organizing on the streets, as you mentioned, collective action, pressuring elites in various ways, holding elites to account in various ways. One last thing about the idea of skepticism and skepticism of the state, which is, I think that, and to go back to what Santosh was saying about a democracy grounded in values, I do think that Ambedkar's phrase, educate, agitate, organize, the first term in that, educate, has very deep meaning in these days of democratic collapse. And my own view, this is not really related to my book, but my own view is that we need to continue to cultivate spaces like this, like what we're doing right now, spaces in which individuals from all walks of life can come together to reflect on the fundamental political, social, moral issues of the day. That kind of a commitment to a liberal education, that is what a liberal education is, that kind of a commitment to liberal education is one additional, call it a strategy, call it a way of life that I think can go some ways that we are in danger of losing in all of our countries, and that can go and that can that it's that the revivification of that may well have significant promise as a form of cultivating the democracies we want to live in. That's not really related to the book. That's just my own reflections.
Thank you, Hari. I think, and Shailesh and Vishal for such a, I think, deep, thoughtful questions and extremely insightful, intelligent presentation. Hari, thank you very much. I know for some of participants could be a new referential point, and because of lack of time, I'm sorry, participants, I'm not able to sort of paraphrase it in Hindi. uh, पर वो कहने की कोशिश कर रहे थे कि कैसा स्टेट एक डेमोक्रेटिक स्टेट होने से रुक रहा है, और एक स्टेट कैसे लोकतंत्र को, जैसे हम अ, अ, बैलगाड़ी पे बैठकर बैलों को कस के रखते हैं वैसा वो कंट्रोल करता है। वो बहुत सारी बातें उन्होंने अलग अलग रेफरेंस से बताई। सो थैंक यू वेरी मच, एंड आई थिंक I just wanted to conclude this session by saying this. Uh, uh, there is something in Ambedkar thought, Hari, I think, which is new and holding democracy intact. However, we get despair by the democracies in the world. There is something that is not outdated, probably, and able to, as I was, yeah, dropping the like liberal democracies needs to anchor into values, and then he connects with the civilizational roots, which most of the democracies lack that profundity. And Dr. Ambedkar tried to bring that profundity to uphold the democracy, which Vishal very rightly pointed out, the creative democracies. That creativity is still there in democracy. Uh, but thank you very much, Hari, for your precious time in spite of your busy life, especially these days. Uh, I, I, I deeply, deeply appreciate your time and the efforts that you put into this very intense presentation, and sometimes this discussion needs to happen. However, we think that it's only in academic sphere and not in public sphere. It needs to bring into a public sphere. It's a difficult process and not easy one, but thank you very much behalf of Center for the Studies and all the organizations. We are honored to have you, and gratitude to you, Hari, for your time and insights that you have given.
Santosh, I am
Thank you.
here.
Yes, Anna.
Thank
Naresh, I congratulate and thank you. I am hearing about your lecture, and I am reading you very seriously. I think it should be continued like this, your academic, intellectual caliber, and you people have to be the future of democracy. You are young people, you have to do in future what we have to do. Thank you very much.
thank
I
you so
think
much.
Naresh, you have to prepare for visit to India in January.
Perfect.
26th, we are going to have a 2-day conference. And we are inviting all scholars who gave lecture this series. We are inviting, we are celebrating our 25 years ending dates. I'm also thanks to Santosh. He's my brother. I don't want to thanks to him, but it's my duty to responsible to. It's a formal thanks, but he is a good organizer, and he without him, I think this series will complete. I think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all.
Thank
All. Thank you, Santosh. Thank you,
thank you.
Naresh. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Hari, I'll talk to you later. Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye, Santosh.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Nice meeting.